If you live in or have ever visited a massive, sprawling global metropolis, whether that's Lagos, London, New York, or even Johannesburg, you know the specific kind of background hum a megacity creates. Millions of human beings moving, breathing, and trying to survive side by side. Tens of thousands of vehicles roaring over massive concrete highway overpasses every single hour of every single day. It is an unrelenting wall of sound, and inside that noise, something strange happens to human perception. You stop noticing details. You stop looking at the spaces between the destinations. When you drive over a flyover bridge on a high speed expressway, you rarely think about what sits directly beneath your wheels. Underneath those giant concrete slabs, the air is different. It's thick with carbon monoxide, wet concrete, stagnant drainage water, and rotting garbage and sweat. Most people speed past those shadowed underpasses without giving them a second thought. We assume those dark pockets are just empty space occupied by discarded tires, drifting dust, or perhaps a displaced person taking shelter from a sudden downpour. We convince ourselves that nothing significant happens under a highway. In February 1999, along the bustling Oslolo Islolo Expressway in Lagos, Nigeria, hundreds of thousands of commuters passed over the Toyota bus stop flyover every single day. They were stuck in the city's notorious go slow traffic, listening to the radio, thinking about their jobs, their families, their evening meals. They had absolutely no idea that beneath those concrete, carrying their heavy sedans and public minibuses, someone was running an open air human slaughterhouse. They didn't know that the thick, greasy smoke occasionally drifting up through the gaps in the bridge deck wasn't coming from burning garbage or firewood. It was the smell of human fat melting over an open pit flame. To truly grasp how a human slaughterhouse could operate undetected beneath one of the busiest highways intersections in West Africa for years, you have to understand the environment of Lagos in the late 1990s, and you have to understand how the public had perceived Clifford Orji. To the local street vendors, bus drivers, and daily commuters around the Oshodi area, Clifford was simply part of the background scenery. He was an outcast. He looked the part of a man completely abandoned by reality. He was unkempt, his hair matted into filthy dreadlocks. His skin was caked in layers of highway grime and soot. He wandered around the concrete pillars wearing torn rags or frequently completely naked. He would pace along the edges of the speeding traffic, muttering wildly to himself, gesturing aggressively at the sky, or waving sticks at passing delivery drivers. To anyone driving by at 40 miles an hour, Clifford Orji was a tragic, albeit familiar sight, a man suffering from severe, untreated psychosis, living on the margins of a city that had no infrastructure to help him. In a city moving at a breakneck speed, people learn to do what urbanites do best: turn their heads, look away, and keep walking. Taking advantage of this collective indifference, Clifford began to build an enclosure directly under the Toyota bus stop flyover, set back against the darkest recess of the concrete support pillars. He constructed a sprawling makeshift fortress. He built it out of discarded automobile tires, rusted corrugated iron sheets, heavy wooden pallets, and shredded plastic tops. From the road, it looked like a massive pile of highway rubbish. a squatter's crude shelter. Every now and then, people in the neighboring residential pockets or traders walking past would notice smoke billowing out of Clifford's tire compound. The smell was foul, heavy, metallic, sickly sweet, and suffocating. But in a dump zone adjacent to a major expressway, bad odors were commonly normal. People assumed he was burning rubber tires or copper wire, or perhaps roasting bushmeat he had trapped in a nearby bush. Nobody investigated the smell, and nobody walked down the embankment to check inside the ring of tires. If they had, they would have seen that Clifford Orji had built an elaborate predatory trap. By day, he played the role of a harmless ranting lunatic. Sometimes he would pivot and claim to be a native doctor, a traditional healer, offering spiritual remedies to those desperate enough to seek him out in the shadows. But when night fell over Lagos and the city traffic slowed to a steady, distant rumble, Clifford became an active predator. According to statements he would later make, he targeted the most vulnerable people navigating the city at night: lone women walking back from late night markets, stranded commuters, and those whose buses had broken down, and the homeless individuals for a place to sleep out of the rain. He claimed he used spellbinding charms and spiritual rituals to disorientate his victims, but the reality was far more visceral and brutal. It was pure brute force, isolation, and terror. He would ambush his victims in the dark near the highway shoulder, overpower them, and drag them down the steep dirt incline into the blackout center of his tire fortress. Once inside, the roar of the overhead traffic acted like a natural acoustic blanket. You could scream at the top of your lungs inside of that pit, and to a driver 40 feet above, it was just another lost sound in the diesel exhaust and the hum of tires on asphalt. What occurred inside of that dark circle of tires over a period of roughly 7 years wasn't an opportunistic murder. It was a methodical, industrial process of human butchery. Clifford did not always kill his victims immediately. He kept them bound with thick rope and iron wire, tethered to rusted iron stakes driven deep into the earth. They were kept in absolute darkness, starved, and subjected to severe physical abuse. When he did decide to slaughter them, he did so with crude, brutal efficiency, using machetes, heavy butcher knives, and meat cleavers. He dismembered his victims on the dirt floor of his shack. He didn't make any attempt to hide the blood or the remains. Instead, he built an open fire pit in the middle of the enclosure, using iron grates salvaged from construction sites to create a makeshift smoking grill. He systematically carved up human torsos, limbs, and organs, curing the meat over the open flame. He ate the flesh himself, but as would later be revealed, the sheer amount of human remains being processed under that bridge was far beyond what a single human being could ever consume. For 7 years, from roughly 1992 to early 1999, this nightmare continued. Cars drove over his head. People walked past 30 yards away with groceries. Police patrols drove by with their sirens blaring on their way to other calls. And all the while, beneath the Toyota bus stop, Clifford Orji sat beside his fire pit in the dark, tending to human flesh sizzling on an open grate. It seemed as though this hidden world would go on indefinitely, swallowed by the sheer noise and chaos of Lagos. But on the morning of February 3rd, 1999, the delicate veil of indifference was violently torn open. It was roughly Wednesday that 3rd. The sun had not yet risen over Lagos, and a cool, heavy morning fog hung over Oshodi Islolo Expressway. A local resident named Joseph Bello was walking home alone after attending an all-night prayer at his local church. His usual walking route took him right past the embankment of the Toyota bus stop. The city was unusually quiet at that hour. The heavy morning rush hour traffic hadn't fully kicked in yet, leaving only a few scattered vehicles cruising down the highway. As Bello reached the concrete support pillars of the flyover, a sound had broke through the quiet air. It wasn't the sound of an engine or of the wind. It was a faint, wet, agonizing, muffled human groan, followed by a bizarre, high-pitched chanting voice coming directly from the inside of Clifford Orji's tire shack. Bello had stopped dead in his tracks. Then the morning breeze shifted direction. Bello was instantly hit with a wall of smell that made his throat seize up and made his tummy violently churn. It wasn't the smell of rotting garbage or exhaust fumes. It was an intense, sickly sweet, greasy odor, the unmistakable smell of meat burning, scorching, and charring over an open wood fire, mingled with the heavy copper stench of fresh blood. Driven by a dreadful curiosity, Joseph Bellow stepped off the paved pedestrian path, crept down the trash-strewed dirt slope, and approached the jagged barrier of stacked tires. He found a small gap where a piece of corrugated iron had slipped away from the frame. He leaned in, placed his eye to the gap, and looked inside. What Joseph Bellow saw through that gap in the tires froze the blood in his very veins. Inside that dim, firelit enclosure, standing over a roaring pit fire, was Clifford Orji. And he was completely naked, his body smeared with ash, soot, and dried blood, resting on an iron grill suspended directly from the open flames were severed human limbs, a partially charged human ribcage, and large slabs of dark, roasting flesh. The dirt floor around the fire pit was a literal nightmare. Scattered across the soil were severed human feet, hands, breasts of a female, and disemboweled organs resting in plastic buckets. Stacks of bloody female clothing were piled in a corner next to the collection of purses, shoes, and wristwatches. And sitting casually on the dirt mound right next to the fire pit was an official police officer's helmet, resting directly beside a pile of picked clean human bones. Joseph Bellow stumbled backwards, gagging, his boots slipping on the loose gravel. He turned and ran towards the main road as fast as his legs could carry him, screaming at the top of his lungs for help. In a dense, high-strung city like Lagos, news of terror doesn't travel through official channels first. It spreads like an explosion on the street. Within 15 minutes, Bellow's screams had drawn the attention of early morning commuters, local street vendors, bus conductors, and taxi drivers. A crowd of dozens rapidly swarmed into a mob of hundreds, armed with sticks, iron bars, and stones. The furious crowd surged down the embankment and surrounded the tire compound. Sensing the incoming mob and hearing the roar of voices, Clifford Orji bolted out of the hidden gap in the back of his shack, attempting to scramble up the concrete support pillars and melt into the highway morning fog. But the crowd was too fast. They cut him off the asphalt, tackled him to the ground, and began to beat him mercilessly with fists, boots, and wooden planks. They dragged his bloodied body back down the underpass, intent on lynching him on the spot. As part of the mob dragged Clifford, others began ripping down the fortress of tires and corrugated iron to dismantle the layer. That was when the mob made an even more horrifying discovery. Tucked away in the darkest, deepest corner of the compound, hidden inside a narrow trench dug directly into the earth behind a wall of stacked car tires, was a living victim. Her name was Awau Lawal. When the crowd pulled back the plastic tarps covering the pit, they found her body lying in her own human waste. She was utterly emaciated, her bones pressing violently against her skin. She was covered in deep bruises, cuts, and dirt, barely conscious and unable to speak higher than a raspy whisper. She was bound hand and foot with heavy ropes. Awawu had been abducted days prior, dragged into that hole and kept as livestock. She had spent days in total darkness, starved, and listening to the agonizing deaths of other victims, and watching through the cracks in her enclosure as Clifford roasted human limbs over his fire pit, knowing within every passing hour that she was meant to be the next person placed on that grill. The sight of Awawu Lawal pushed the mob over the edge. The crowd screamed for blood. They had tossed a tire over Clifford's head and were preparing to set him on fire, a form of street vigilante punishment known as necklacing. When heavy police sirens finally cut through the air, multiple police units were deployed from a nearby Makinde police station, swarmed the underpass, firing warning shots into the air to disperse the thousands of furious citizens who were packing the expressway. After an intense standoff, officers had managed to get Clifford Orji's body into the back of a police van. They lifted the frail, dying body of Awawu Lawal out of the pit and rushed her under escort to the Lagos State University Teaching Hospital. The public believed the nightmare was finally over, that a crazy cannibal had been caught, and an innocent woman had been saved. But in reality, the horror was only just the beginning to reveal the true scope. As medical teams fought to save Awawu Lawal's life at the hospital, forensic investigators and crime scene officers had sealed off the Toyota bus stop underpass to catalogue what laid inside Clifford Orji's compound. What they uncovered elevated this case from the story of a solitary man into one of the most terrifying scandals in the country's history. When police forensic teams excavated the small pit of dirt under the bridge and the adjacent shack, belonging to Clifford's known associate, a man named Tahiru Aliwu, who had also been arrested nearby, they recovered over 30 human skulls stacked into neat piles or buried in shallow soil, dozens of plastic buckets filled with fresh and cooked human internal organs, livers, hearts, and kidneys preserved in dark liquids, massive bags filled with female undergarments, blood-soaked dresses, shoes, rings, and wallets, identification belonging to missing persons from all across Nigeria. A deep vertical pit, nearly 4 meters deep, dug beneath the concrete footing of the bridge, fitting with wooden trapdoors used to keep multiple victims restrained simultaneously before they were butchered. Every single piece of physical evidence pointed to an operation that had been running with terrifying efficiency for years. When police paraded Clifford Orji before a packed press conference at the police headquarters, the public expected to see a catatonic, incoherent man. Instead, Clifford stood before the cameras, entirely unbothered, grinning at the reporters, and when journalists had pushed microphones into his face and asked him if he had truly killed and eaten those human beings. His response was a cold, casual, and utterly chilling response. The confession alone sent shockwaves through the country, but it was what police found hidden inside a leather pouch deep within Clifford's shack that turned the entire investigation on its head. Among the pile of bones and trash, investigators recovered two specific items that made zero sense for a naked, homeless, mentally ill man living in a pit under a bridge. First was a bank check made out for the sum of 80,000 naira. In Nigeria in February 1999, 80,000 naira was a massive fortune, equivalent to many months or even years of a standard civil servant's salary. And second, a fully functional high-end mobile telephone. Let me put the discovery of that mobile phone into proper historical context for you. In February of 1999, commercial GCSM mobile phone networks hadn't yet been fully launched for the general public in Nigeria. Mobile phones were an extreme luxury item, accessible almost exclusively to the ultra wealthy individuals, high ranking government officials, top military commanders, or powerful international business elites. A homeless man living in a dirt hole under the highway bridge literally could not walk into a store and just buy a mobile phone. Who gave a madman living under a bridge a state of the art mobile phone? And who wrote a 80,000 naira check to a man who wore rags and ate out of tire pits? When investigators pushed him on these items during his initial interrogations, Clifford dropped a bombshell. He stated clearly that he wasn't working alone, and he was not killing simply to satisfy his own appetite. He confessed he was operating as an organ harvester and a human meat supplier for an elite clientele. He claimed wealthy businessmen, influential politicians, and practitioners of dark ritual magic or spiritual ritual cults were paying him immense sums of money for fresh human organs, skulls, and female body parts. He alleged that late at night, under the cover of darkness, expensive luxury sedans with tinted windows would roll off the expressway, drive down the unlit dirt track under the Toyota bus stop flyover, and they would park near his tire shop. Occupants would hand over stacks of cash or checks, and Clifford would hand over plastic buckets, fresh human hearts, livers, and limbs. And there was one devastating piece of physical evidence at the crime scene that directly supported Clifford's claim about selling specific body parts to high paying buyers. He had found evidence that dozens of other victims had been completely dismembered, but their heads were nowhere to be found on the property. The heads had been neatly severed, packaged, and removed from the location entirely. The heads had been sold. At this point, the public expected the largest criminal investigation in West African history. They expected the police to analyze the call logs on the mobile phone, trace the account numbers on that 80,000 naira check, track down the luxury cars, and dismantle an elite network of wealthy murderers and ritual traffickers. Instead, the investigation hit a sudden deafening wall of silence. Within days of the discovery, official police press releases began to drastically change their tone. The mention of the mobile phone was suddenly downpoured and dismissed. The origin of the 80,000 naira check was never publicly explained or brought to light in open court. The official narrative shifted rapidly away from a sophisticated organ trafficking syndicate and reverted strictly back to a simple, convenient story. Clifford Orji was just a solitary, insane cannibal acting entirely on his own psychotic impulses. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the only surviving eyewitness who could have testified about what she saw and heard inside that pit, Awawu Lawal, never got the chance to speak. Despite the best efforts of medical personnel, the severe physical trauma, systematic infections, and catastrophic psychological horror she had endured were too much for her broken body to bear. Awawu Lawal had slipped into a deep coma and had died in her hospital bed a few days after her rescue, taking whatever secrets, names, or voices she had heard under that bridge to her grave. Clifford Orji and his accomplice Ahiru Aliwu were formally remanded to the Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison in Lagos in late 2000. And then the judicial system simply stopped moving. Clifford was never formally tried in a court of law, and he was never convicted of murder. He was never given a formal sentence. He was placed in legal limbo, transferred to a psychiatric wing of the maximum security prison, and efficiently forgotten by the legal system. Year after year passed. Clifford sat in a dark cell in Kirikiri. His mental health, already fragile, collapsed completely. Guards and fellow inmates reported he spent his last days and nights screaming at the concrete walls, screaming bizarre chants, muttering incoherently, refusing food, and slowly decaying in his cell. In 2012, 13 years after the arrest, human rights lawyers and legal advocacy groups attempted to file a petition demanding that the Lagos state government either formally try Clifford Orji or process him according to the law, citing that leaving any human being to rot in a cell for over a decade without a trial was a complete collapse of constitutional justice. The court never got the chance to hear the petition, however, because on August 7, 2012, prison officials had walked up to Clifford Orji's cell during the morning rounds and had found him unresponsive on his thin mattress. He was pronounced dead at the age of 46. The official cause of death was listed simply as natural causes. With his death, the final door had slammed shut, and the records of who owned that mobile phone, the names attached to those bank documents, the identity of the luxury cars pulling up under the highway at 3 a.m., and the ultimate fate of the dozens of missing heads were buried permanently alongside Clifford Orji. Today, if you travel through Lagos, along the Oshodi Islolo Expressway, the Toyota bus stop is still there, and it remains a massive, roaring, vibrant hub of life, commerce, and movement. Millions of people cross over that concrete flyover every month, sitting in buses, listening to Afro beats on their phone, heading to work, or simply going home to their families. The old makeshift fortress of tires, rusted corrugated iron, and ash pit were cleared away decades ago, and the dirt embankment is covered in weeds, plastic wraps, and urban dust. To the average commuter driving past today, it's just another piece of concrete supporting another highway. Most of the young people traveling that road had absolutely no idea what happened beneath that slab of concrete 27 years ago. They don't know about the tire shack, the sweet smell of burning human fat drifting into the morning air, or the victims whose names were erased inside of that pit. Clifford Orji died inside a concrete cell in Kirikiri prison. But the true, horrifying lesson of the Toyota bus stop case remains. It is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters in our world don't always hide in deep, untouched forests or isolated abandoned farmhouses in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes they set up shop right in the middle of our most crowded cities, and they sit right under our highways, right beneath our car tires, operating in the shadows of our collective indifference, waiting for us to look away, waiting for us to turn up the radio, and waiting for the noise of the world to drown out the screams beneath the bridge. And thank you for watching.